Hi, everyone. My name's Andrew Lai. I'm your co host of the ROI from AI podcast.
And I'm Amir Nissen. Each episode, we talk with the people driving AI adoption and find out what's really moving the needle.
So I'm so excited to have Simon Kriss joining us today. And I'll throw it to you in just a moment to give a very thorough introduction of yourself. But Simon is the CEO of Sovereign AI Australia, and he's doing fantastic work. So, yeah, Simon, over to you to just give a brief intro, if that's all right.
Yeah, of course. Thanks, Andrew and Amir, and great to be connected with everyone listening. I have a rather interesting, one might say, checkered background. I didn't take a career in any one industry, like I wasn't 20 years with banking or whatever. Instead, I kind of played in a whole lot of industries and spent most of my career in and around customer experience and in particular call centers and things. And I'd always had a fascination with AI. I think just because I'm a bit of a nerd. And in the CX space, the customer experience space, AI never really delivered on the promise. There was lots of hype, lots of talk for years, but outside of some simple regression analysis to figure out why a customer was leaving or something, it didn't really deliver on the promise. And it was only when generative AI came along, even in the early stages, that I started to see what impact this would have on things like speech to text and text to speech and just making chatbots and things way more conversational. And so I lent in and lent in and lent in. And I remember getting to a point where I said to my wife, right, I'm going all in on AI. That's what I'm going to work on now. And she said, you're crazy. Nobody's doing anything with AI. What are you talking about? And it was almost 90 days later to the day that ChatGPT launched. And so, the timing kind of came out there, and I've been working in and around full-time AI ever since.
Oh, that's fantastic. And, just so that we've got a bit of a disclaimer out there, I did know Simon before he did Sovereign AI Australia. And yeah, you're quite an executive in the customer experience space doing many things. And you're probably underselling yourself in terms of not knowing or having a huge background in AI. You were already a bit of an AI expert back then. So yeah, I guess my first question would be, you know, on your pathway to finding about starting Sovereign AI Australia,
Mhm.
what really pushed you then to commit, and then what were your steps in actually starting it?
Yeah, that's a great question. I was just looking at how the industry was shaping. How were companies using generative AI in Australia? Because a lot of people just take the letters AI as being, oh, that's generative AI. Actually, there's a whole lot of forms of AI that have been around for years and years. It's not just the new kid on the block, but they don't kind of see it that way. And in working through with them, I often wound up talking to chief risk officers and looking at what are the risks with AI. And one of the big risks that we have in Australia, in particular, is this issue around transparency and trust. So KPMG and Melbourne Uni did a huge piece of work where they were interviewing people from all around the world, asking about their opinions on trust of AI. And one question in particular in the report stood out to me, and it was the question of, do you think the risks outweigh the benefits? And Australia came in last. Well, not last,
Yeah,
like it was
wow.
a race, but just bottom of that list. We simply don't trust AI in a corporate setting. Happy to use it at home in our personal lives. Don't trust it in a corporate setting. And the more I dug into that, the more this lack of transparency was there. And so that was one of the drivers towards sovereign AI. But the bigger one, I guess, was that I could see this ongoing risk that denial of service would be very easy. Having our links cut to the US would be relatively easy. Having a certain president slap a 50% tariff on AI could be relatively easy. And it was all of those. So it was all that was kind of risk driven that I just kind of identified that Australia needed to have some form of sovereign capability in this country that, if it all went to hell, we could still have something that we could rely on here. And we don't have that today.
And that's not just the way it's worked with cloud, where you've got the big cloud providers, and sometimes they'll set up a center in Sydney or what have you. You're actually arguing that Australia should have its own sort of ideally frontier type LLM.
Correct. We need a
Yes.
foundational model in this country. We have some foundational models, right? So we already have a foundational image model in Leonardo. We have Harrison AI that's done some stuff. The guys at Main Code have built that small Matilda, that small language model. But we need more of that. We need more foundational capability, because when you build any AI model, not just a language model, but any AI model, the way that you understand exactly what data went into that model, but more importantly, you understand how it went in, what bias was naturally introduced by the way in which you consume data. And I'll give you a really simple example. I wrote a book 18 months ago, 2 years ago, I don't know, I've lost track of how long ago, called The AI Empowered Customer Experience. Now, if you decided to ingest that book, but when you looked at it, you said, well, actually, we don't need the preface and we don't need the foreword by Simon. We really just need from chapter 1 onwards. That simple decision has introduced bias into what has gone into the model. And if you think about that across 2 million books, you're making a big difference. So that was part of it. But the other part is that the current model owners in the US and France and China won't tell us where their data came from. They won't tell us how they got it and what they got. And was it fair to Australian creatives? And so I have this real sense of national pride. I think it goes back to my military days. I've just got this sense of national pride that says, well, hang on, Australian content creators need to be made whole for the content that they create, whether that's what I call static data. So, I wrote a book, I wrote a poem, I wrote a song, and it's published. Or whether that's dynamic data, which is what all the journos do every day. That both those forms need to be compensated if I'm using them to make a product that's going to derive profit. Right? If the government was going to build this, and I wish the Australian government would do it, but they just seem to have no interest. If the government did it, then you could argue, okay, you should contribute to this because it's for the betterment of the entire country and nobody's making a profit out of it. It's a government thing. But that's not the case here. And so, we need a model that's been built and operates within our privacy laws, our copyright laws, and our values, our sense of what's fair and what's not. Does it pass the barbecue test of you explain it to somebody and they go, yeah, that sounds fair. That's, for me, that's the important stuff.
I totally agree there, Simon. And I note that you use the term barbecue test. So that's obviously an Australian term, which I'm sure your model will go through.
I hope so.
And I made a post about this a couple of weeks ago. And so I guess I sort of already know the answer, but just so that you could tell the audience, I mean, why couldn't you just get a large language model like the Facebook Llama before, one of these open source models, and then just reconfigure that? Would that be sufficient or not really?
That's a great question. And in actual fact, that's what Singapore has done. That's what Taiwan has done. They've taken Llama and retuned it to be their national model. For me, that doesn't hold water. That doesn't really work. And the reason is that even though they call them open source, most often they're not. They're free to use, but they're not completely open. If they were open sourced, they would share with you the data set that they used, all of the prompting, like everything from the ground, and they don't. Now, you can take something like Llama and untrain it and retrain it, fine tune it, but you're only ever going to maybe adjust 40% of the weights, 45% of the weights. You're not going to be able to change the model right from the base layer. And you still don't know, was the base information sourced ethically and what bias went into that. You will never know that. Then stack on top of that companies like Meta, and they've just done this, have announced that they're no longer supporting Llama. They're going to go off and build a commercial model. So your model now is stuck in time. It never gets an upgrade. Keep kind of fine tuning it, but it never gets any more bells and whistles. And the other thing is that there's research, some great research that's been done that shows that even when you do detune and retune a model, you tend to do that in English. And so when you ask a question in English, you get the new answer. But if you ask that question in Italian, you're still going to get the old answer because it hasn't retuned for Italian and Greek just based on what it was picked up at the time. So there's a number of reasons why that's a great short-term fix. And look, I know businesses, the Australian Tax Office has told us that that's an approach that they've taken for some of their work, is they've tried to get an open weight model and retune it. And that may work for a while, but it still doesn't give you sovereign capability. It's domestic. Other people say, well, can't we just download OpenAI and have it on a local server? Isn't that sovereign? No, that's domestic, but it's not sovereign. It's not Australia's.
And does it still work if we have a sovereign LLM that is maybe a few generations behind the frontier models coming out of the US and China?
Absolutely, it does. Like, who is actually using all of the features of OpenAI 5? We could probably still get by with OpenAI 3.5, right? Or 4, right? It's just like, there's just not many people that are using it. And in actual fact, people say to me, oh, Simon, why are you doing this? You can't possibly compete with ChatGPT. And I keep saying to them, I don't need to compete with ChatGPT. That's not what Australia needs. What Australia needs right now is for a lot of the base language work, and particularly as a part of agentic processes, where it may be parsing customer information, secure information, health information. We need a model that can understand what it's being asked to do that, and move on. I mean, if you look at another way of considering this is if you look at the way the two superpowers are building AI, China and the US. China is building very practical, very pragmatic, often embodied AI, like a lot of robotics. And then their language models aren't massive language models. They're smaller, but they do the job. What America's trying to do is build God in a box. Right? They're going after this artificial general intelligence because they think that's how they win the race. What business in Australia is looking for artificial general intelligence? Nobody. We're looking for tools that work. And so in actual fact, you don't need a 1.2 trillion parameter model. You could do most of what you wanted to do, most Australian businesses need to do, with probably a 300 billion parameter model or less. So the idea here isn't that we go into competition with OpenAI or Anthropic or Mistral or DeepSeek, but rather we're complementary. We're kind of saying, look, for 80% of the work that you do, using an offshore model might be fine because you're using public information or non-sensitive information or, whatever, it's fine. But there will be a slice, an Accenture in a report estimated it at 30%. I think that's probably slightly over. But there will be a slice of particularly agentic stuff that needs to, A, be held securely and safely and processed here in this country without reference to the US Cloud Act, and we can talk about that. But also that it's a model that people know and trust and understand. Because the Attorney General can come to me and say, Simon, I want to know how that model was built. And under NDA, I'll happily open and share that. I doubt that even if the Attorney General went to Anthropic, that they're going to share how they built their model. They're just not going to do it. And so it's those types of things that kind of make the work that myself and so many others in this country are doing as really critical.
Since you mentioned it, Simon, perhaps we should explore it a little bit more in depth. Could you tell us a little bit about the US Cloud Act and how that impacts on what you're doing?
Yeah, the Cloud Act's an interesting piece of American legislation. It's been around for about 7 years. Actually, I think it's almost 8 years now. And Australia signed up to it about 2.5 years ago. It's an extension of the Patriot Act. And essentially, and I'm oversimplifying here, but essentially what it says is that the US government can compel companies, US companies, to share the contents of any server that they own or lease anywhere in the world, regardless of jurisdiction. And then it goes on to say that if they're a service provider, that they're not allowed to tell their client that the government is looking. So just think about that for a minute. You know, the Australian government is using large swathes of AWS, Microsoft, Google, all of those types of things, all of the hyperscalers for storage capability, as are most Australian companies. That means that any of those servers could be looked in almost at will by the FBI, the CIA, the American government. Now, Andrew, if you had a server that you purchased and you owned and it sat in your house or your shed and, it ran from there, it was completely Australian. If the US government want to look in that server, they have to go to the Australian government, request that. The Australian government would then have to go to court and get a court order to compel you to share your data. That's not the case in America. They've gotten around the whole need for the legal system. The government just says, we want this data. And I've spoken to people who worked in some of these US corporations, one that worked for a US telco, where they were told, you have 30 days to give us a copy of every customer record that you hold and usage data for every customer. And they had no choice but to comply. So, when you think about our most sensitive data in this country sitting in the hands of companies that can be compelled to comply with the US Cloud Act, and stack on top of that, that recently Marco Rubio, the US Secretary of State, sent a message, a telegram, or whatever it's called these days, a memo, out to all of the diplomats around the world, and it was leaked. And it basically said that every diplomat should be actively lobbying against sovereign data, sovereign IT, sovereign thing, right? So the US is actively trying to stop countries having sovereign capability and capacity. That's a big red flag for me. And so everything that we're doing, we're saying, look, not only, we have to buy NVIDIA or AMD or those types of chips because we don't have chip manufacturing in this country. But once we've purchased it, that should be an Australian company running that in an Australian data center that only is affected by Australian law. And so what we're committing to is not only that the server, the GPUs that we build the model on will be here, but we're committing that the GPUs that the model's inferenced on will also be here and not part of a hyperscaler. And we've had to talk to the hyperscalers because they've all come to us and said, oh, we can work with you. And we've said, no, sorry, we can't, because you're a US-owned company.
You certainly make a compelling case. How far away are you, or how far away is Australia?
Further than I'd like to be. As in, we've done a lot of the planning work, and we've done a lot of the work that it will sound odd if I go through it, but the work that is actually more complicated than building the tech, and that's solving a lot of the ethical and other dilemmas. But to build the model, requires a lot of compute, so it's very cash upfront heavy. Which means we need investors. And we are struggling in Australia to find that investment. Now, of course, we could go to the US and get it, but then how is that sovereign if it's owned by a US? You know what I mean? We're kind of chasing our tails. And finding that money in Australia is really, really difficult because the Australian investment community, unfortunately, is not quite as AI savvy as we'd like them to be. And they definitely don't see the burning bridge that's coming. One would hope that the issues with oil supply kind of raise a red flag that, hey, that's not just oil that's going to be a problem here. Anything that is, the amount of economic benefit that is leaking out of this country right now in terms of AI use is just astounding. Companies are paying hundreds of thousands of dollars a month in token consumption, and all of that money is just flowing straight offshore. Right? None of it's being kept here. So, we're still on the hunt. So, if anybody listening to this happens to have a spare $30 or $40 million, I'd love to talk to you. But we have solved a number of the other kind of more complex ethical issues.
And just to see if perhaps this podcast might be able to give you a bit of a plug, were there any messages, Simon, that you wanted to give out to the investment community, or any thoughts that you might want to give out to sort of boost your case a little bit? And happy for you to use this as a platform.
So that's a great question, Andrew. Look, I think a lot of what the message I would want to get across, we've already talked about. It's people understanding that there is a burning bridge. It's not, going to drop on us next week, but there is a burning need for what we're doing. When you get beyond the simple, economics of it, you also start getting into the societal impacts. Do we want our kids growing up using models that install US values? The American president has already said he wants the next round of frontier models to be less woke. Doesn't want them talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion. It doesn't want them talking about gay rights. It doesn't want them talking about climate change. All of those things are important to Australians. I have grandchildren and I already hear them talking about walking down the sidewalk, not the footpath. I hear them talking about wanting candy, not lollies. And these simple little things, but it starts to go to the heart of that societal impact. The other piece, of course, is what are the current offshore models doing for our Indigenous communities? And how are we going to handle the very sensitive data and very sensitive nature of Indigenous communities? Are they just relegated to not having any kind of AI? Does it not work for them? But, these are larger societal things. So I would welcome anybody who wanted to talk about the need for sovereignty in this country and how we go about doing that. But no matter how we go about doing it, the one big hurdle right at the start is that you have to have compute power to do this. And it's significant compute power. And as we all know, the reason NVIDIA is worth $4 trillion is that compute power costs a lot of money. And so that's what we need to solve for first.
You did mention earlier in the chat that, ideally this would be a government-led initiative and the government would be funding their own sovereign model. Do you think that it should be a startup, it should be a small company doing this, or should it be with government and help, or should it be a conglomerate or a consortium between, universities and research institutions and maybe a few different commercial players? Or what's your take on that?
Look, a consortium is a beautiful idea as an idea. When you get to the reality of, the people, it's who puts the money in, right? And so if it's companies putting the money in, if it's individuals putting money in, they want a return on their investment. We live in a capital society, right? I would love to see something between government and universities. I think that our academics have some great research already, but I think there is some brilliant research that could be done sitting alongside the build of a new model, research that may not have been done anywhere else in the world before, but that would take a lot of willingness from the government. And let me, kind of phrase it. We're estimating that it would cost around about $100 million Aussie end to end to build a model. We're not talking billions and billions of dollars because, like I said, we're not going after ChatGPT. We're just trying to build a model for Australia. But the Australian government has shown hesitation. The National Reconstruction Fund has shown hesitation. But if we look at countries like Switzerland, they've built a model that the government fully funded. In India, the government has commissioned the two big telcos to take it on and do it on their behalf. So there's different approaches being taken in different countries. In Malaysia, government paid for the Bahasa Malay model, but private companies are coming together to build an English model for Malaysia. So, we're not the only ones in the world that are thinking about this. Canada is doing it. There's multiple countries around the world that are working on these types of concepts, all because they want a model that is sovereign owned and it represents their culture and their vernacular a little bit more than what a standard world model would. Like if you look at a world model, an open AI, an Anthropic or whatever, Australia's data is maybe 1.5% of the total database, which is punching above our weight given our population. But I'd like a model here for Australia that was 5, 6, 8% Australian data, and that the model was biased towards that data. So that when an Australian child asks what's it like to be in the Navy, they don't hear about the US Navy. They hear about the Australian Navy first, and then they can say, oh no, I meant the US, and we can, bring that data in. So that's kind of what we want and need to achieve.
That's really fascinating, Simon. And of course, we go out and speak with a lot of small to medium enterprises. And one of the biggest concerns that a lot of these SMEs have is, is my data private? How can I at SMEC AI guarantee that that data won't be misused? And I always say, look, I can't guarantee anything because obviously the models are being processed overseas. The models themselves are from overseas. From your perspective, do you think this kind of initiative that you've got, Sovereign AI Australia, building Australian models, do you think that might assist the wider economy and businesses and small businesses in particular with building trust in AI?
Yeah, that's exactly the point, Andrew. The idea of Sovereign Australia AI is to absolutely have a model that businesses can totally trust. In other words, we've engaged with the Privacy Commissioner's Office and with the eSafety Commissioner's Office, and we want them looking over our shoulder as we build. We want them to do that so that when I'm Jim's Plumbing with 15 people or I'm, whatever, I can actually say, well, hang on, this is a model I can trust because this is a model that's been built here and operates here under our laws. And yes, the data might be moving to a data center, but that's still a data center in Australia and it's still controlled by Australians. So if something goes wrong, I can take legal action. I have a recourse. I can, make my insurance company happy that I did everything that I could do. Whereas we get, a big data leak from a US company. Well, so sorry, Australia. Yeah. So, yeah, I think it's actually critical to getting over this hump in adoption. I mean, you guys would have seen it at SMEC AI for sure. That, yes, it's great. Yes, it's great. Yes, it's great. But, there's always this big but at the end. And it comes down to that trust thing. And this is one of the only ways we're going to be able to get around it, is to be able to say, this is how it was built. This is the data it was built on. I'm not going to tell you every single document, but, we used this many books and we used this many reports and we used this over here and this over here. And, we got the records from the Office of Public Records of Queensland, or whatever it was that we used. And so Australians know where that's coming from. I think that's going to go a long way to building that trust.
Once we do have a sovereign model, it'll require a government mandate to say, much like we do have in healthcare, like you need to use the sovereign AI model for this use case? Or do you think it stands up as a commercial entity on its own?
I think it definitely stands up as a commercial entity on its own. Even at 10% of the total token use in Australia, that business is making money, right? It will. I think there's a chance that the government will want to step in and label it critical infrastructure, which impedes the ability to sell the company at some point. We haven't, it's quite surprising how little engagement we've had from the government. I would have thought Department of Defense would have been wanting to talk to us. I definitely thought that the Australian Federal Police would have wanted to talk to us because, if you look at the US models, the FBI mandates that they keep all inference data for at least 90 days in case the FBI want to go searching in it, because there's a person of interest or something, anti-terrorism type stuff. We haven't had any of those types of discussions. So I think there's a little bit of embryonic kind of focus here by the Australian government. It's taken us until now to come out with a national AI plan. And while I applaud that we have a national AI plan, to me, it's kind of it didn't really spark any great, amazing, this is going to be, it was more of a data center plan than an AI plan, I hate to say. And, the guys at the National AI Center and the Digital Transformation Agency are doing great work and pushing as hard as they can. But we need the government to be far more proactive into this space and understand it before we can kind of go anywhere. So to answer your question, yep, it definitely can be a commercial entity, but to be a commercial entity, you've got to get the investment first.
So that's quite interesting. And I never thought of Amir's idea there, but it does make a lot of sense where, there's already regulations for the medical industry, for example, that data needs to be kept onshore. So that's almost like quite a novel, but, logical idea that the models would potentially need to be models that were created here. But then along the thought train of your commercial model, do you see yourself as potentially being a software as a service, or is it something that people could potentially download, run on their own machines on premises? Because internally, we've started developing this theory that on premises will become a big thing in Australia, that, sovereign models and sovereign data and being able to physically have control over your own servers is important. Do you see yourself getting onto on-premises, or do you think it'll be more like a SaaS play?
I think it'll be a SaaS play. And the argument against on-prem is that getting GPUs is tough. Just accessing GPUs, let alone the cost. And then a GPU isn't like a standard Dell server that you pull out of the box and you stick in the rack and you fire it up and you go. GPUs have got to be tuned. They've got to be set up to do a specific job. Are they being set up more for training, or are they being set up more for inference? What kind of inference speed? Blah, 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 blah. So I don't think there's enough trained people and enough dollars and availability for the on-prem to become a reality for most businesses. Now, there may be some exceptions to that. Maybe the 7 police forces in Australia need to have something on-prem. Maybe the DoD needs to have something on-prem. But for most businesses, I would think not. But I think the push towards on-prem is because there isn't sovereign kind of cloud capability. And I think as we start to solve for that, that will become the greater play, right? I look, I would love to think that at some point, we've seen the Kelly Gallagher, the finance minister, already talk about Gov AI chat. Well, I'd love to think that Gov AI chat was sitting on a sovereign model and sitting on something based here, whether it's our model or not, sitting on hardware that's based here, controlled by people who are based here. But the reality is at the moment, that's not going to happen. So yes, we would love to see some kind of a mandate come out that says where you are using confidential data, where you're using citizen data in particular, that's got to be through a sovereign model. And if that play started, then you would, I think, see groups like Microsoft Copilot offering a sovereign model as one of the alternative models in their ecosystem that we don't see today. I mean, already they've opened the doors from not only OpenAI to now offering Anthropic, and I think that will kind of grow. So I think what we'll all wind up with is more of an orchestration layer that allows us to use different models for different jobs.
this is a largely tongue-in-cheek question, but have you asked the latest ChatGPT model to spin off a sovereign AI model for Australia?
I haven't, but I doubt it would be able to do it anyway. It's a probabilistic model. I love it when people ask deterministic questions of a probabilistic model and then wonder why they don't get a good answer. But no, I haven't asked that. I even toyed with the idea of approaching Anthropic or approaching Mistral and saying, hey, do you want to fund us building a sovereign model so that you win on both sides of the table? But once again, that wouldn't be Australian funded, and we get all of those types of things. So it's an interesting dilemma, it really is.
So we're starting to run out of time, Simon, but I guess I wanted to get your thoughts on where you think AI and AI in Australia will head in perhaps the next 12 months. I mean, things are happening so quickly that I don't want to talk about the next 3 years or five
Okay,
years
good.
because it's almost like science fiction, right? But
Correct.
what do you think will occur in the next 12 months in our local ecosystem, especially with regards to sovereign AI?
Well, thank you for not asking what's it going to look like in 5 years or 3 years, because anybody that answers that question is a lunatic. Um, I think that across the next 12 months, we're unfortunately going to see some car crashes, some horrendous car crashes. Be that leaked data, be that hacks, be that, because people are jumping into, let's use OpenClaw without knowing what the security is. Let's use MCP connectors without knowing what the security is. So I think that the old cybersec is going to start to really play again, mostly being driven by agentic processes. That is, processes where there isn't a human in the loop and the AI has agency to just go off and do the job that it's being asked to do. It will have no compunction in sharing data if it thinks that that's how it's going to best serve what the user asked for. It doesn't understand everything that humans understand, or value the things that humans value. So, unfortunately, I think across the back end of this year, we're going to see some horrible car crashes. But for those that started in early, have got really solid AI literacy across their organization, which is probably the single biggest issue we have in this country. But for those companies that have rolled out great AI literacy, they've got good, robust governance frameworks in place, and they are being selective about what they go after, those players are going to have a five-fold leap over their competitors and others in the market. So I think you're going to see this great splitting or shifting between the haves and the have-nots in terms of those that have built the infrastructure, the systems, the processes around themselves to be able to accelerate, and those that accelerate without having done that work and crash and burn.
I guess, thank you for that. Last question from me. I'll make it a bit of a lighter one. What's
That'd be nice.
what's your favorite use of AI, like in your day-to-day?
My favorite use of AI. I get the most out of AI by using it in reverse. I know that sounds odd. So, what a lot of people do is they go to AI and they say, I want you to draft for me a report on sustainable farming in Maribyrnong, right? And off it goes and it does the work. I tend to like to use it to prompt my thinking, pull my information out of my head. And so, my favorite use is to say to it, hey, I've got to write this report, or I've got to run this workshop, or I've got to do this, or I've got to do that. I want you to interview me for the next half hour around what I should be thinking about, help me draw out my ideas. And I will often do that in the talking app on the phone rather than the desktop app while I'm driving in the car. And I'll have it interview me because I live an hour out of Melbourne. It will interview me for an hour in the car. And when I get out of the car, I have that whole transcript there that I can start to work with. So that's probably my favorite use case. And closely behind that, if I'm allowed to have a second, is having AI write some custom bedtime stories for my grandchildren because they love it. They can dictate it's set in the land of frogs, and there's a fairy there, and there's a dog called Pongo, and yeah, they just love the creativity.
Those are both wonderful use cases, Simon. I'm definitely going to give the interviewing one a go. That's fantastic. And I don't have grandchildren yet, so that might have to wait till later. Well, look, thank you so much, Simon, for joining us. It's been super insightful. We've learned a lot about you. And just before we hit the complete button, was there any other final message that you wanted to give?
Look, just that AI is not just AI. Dig into it, learn about it, and it's experiential. Don't just read, get in, play with these tools, ask questions of your vendors, really understand this stuff. If you know, there's a number of great people that you can follow on LinkedIn that have good, valid AI information. You know, not just they sat in front of ChatGPT for 2 months, now they're an expert. There's some really good people and really good things to follow out there. So keep learning.
Thank you so much, Simon, and really appreciate the chat. If you'd like to learn more about ROI from AI or Sovereign AI Australia, just jump onto our website and find out more. Thank you all.
Thanks, Simon.
Thanks both.